Toiano. E karama, we've just got a few more notices for you. You know how I said to everyone, just read the notes when it comes to housekeeping. Oh, you got it sus. There's one little thing that I need to touch on. We're talking about kōri order. What about pukahukahu order? Pukahukahu, lungs, vaping, smoking. Could we just make sure, thank you to everyone for going to the car park, but could you be on the roadside side? Because apparently there's smoke and vape wafting into areas. So please, when you do that, could you please go to the roadside side. Kapai? Kia ora tātou. Okay, now we are going to be joined by an online speaker called Abbie Reynolds Tanehua, and her kōrero is entitled The Barriers to Solving Climate Change and Biodiversity Loss Together, and what they tell us about our conservation challenges more broadly. Now, Abbie is currently a Next Foundation Fellow, and she's been looking at how to accelerate the uptake of solutions to both the climate and biodiversity crises. She's also a director of Auckland Transport. She's had a busy week, and chair of Westpac's External Sustainability Advisory Panel. Previously CEO of Predator Free 2050 Limited, and prior to that, Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council. In 2017, she co-founded the Climate Leaders Coalition. With a background in corporate sustainability, telecoms, policy, and law, she's worked primarily in Tāmaki Makaurau and London, but now calls Nelson home. And that's where she's coming to us today. Tēnā koe. Hopefully you can hear us, Abbie. Homai te pakipaki o kia kaha te pakipaki.
Kia ora koutou. Yes, I can hear you beautifully. I can't see any of you though, so if you're smiling at me, maybe make a noise when you're doing it.
Oh, sorry, Abbie. There's just two of us on stage who can hear you, but nobody else can.
We're going to try and get your sound going through the speakers, which
Perfect.
it was working earlier today, so I'm not actually sure why that's not
Abbie,
working.
could you give us a mic check, mic check?
Mic check, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, that's not working. Okay, we will give that a little go. Why do we get the hapu woman and everything to do? Hey, that's because they can do everything.
Daniel.
Okay, while we are waiting,
Computer sound.
I'd like you to please wow me with some of your knowledge. When it comes to Cody, when it comes to all of our...
Abbie, can you talk, please?
So, could you please tell me, kumara hou, what's our scientific word for kumara hou?
One more time.
Hi, hey, hello.
I was going to say that, yeah. Exactly that one. What about one of our most important, one of our most important, caprosma. What is caprosma in Māori? Haramu. I had this on Whānau Living. We're going, it's caprosma, and I'm like, what? It's haramu. And why does that sound like a SPC and, you know, the Latin version?
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay. Kahate hioi. What is hioi?
Yes, doing it.
Hioi in Māori, what is it in English?
They told me to change it to that.
Hioi is a word for minutes. Hioi.
Can you say something?
Check,
That's
check,
what
check.
Alexis do.
No,
I'm also going to give you a bit of a spoiler alert. I don't know if any of you have seen the first series of Origins, a couple that my husband, Scotty Morrison, did. This series coming up this month on TV1. It's following the path of the kumara. The kumara does not speak of how sweet it is, and it does not have waiwai, but we follow the path of the kumara to speak to origins of Māori. So, of course, he has gone as far as, can you guess where it might be? Peru. He goes to Peru. He goes to Chile.
Check, 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 check,
Yes.
check.
He is a lot taller than everybody else there. And then he comes to Rapa Nui.
just try again.
And
Check,
the
check,
place
check.
where he said
Can you
our
hear that?
reo is most similar, Rapa Nui and Marquesas.
I think you're being heard better now, Abbie.
Yeah.
Oh, and Peru, they have their word for kumara is popara. Tinotata, very, very close. And they still have a word they will refer to, what do we call our pendants that we have here, that we wear? Or toki? They use the word toki kura. And that's because our tupuna and our exchanges, they would bring and offer toki. And so their po, they still have toki. And that was a free ad from my husband's show because he was away for about 2 months. I had to look after everything. So we might as well enjoy it. So, te kumara. Ina koia kaya koutou, tēnā koutou manawanui mai. Have we got it, sis, now?
I think so. Just speak loud, please, Abbie, if you can.
Oh.
So speak loudly from Nelson. Thank you, Abbie.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Okay, so shouty, which is a happy space. So, no airangi aku tipuna, I tai mai aku tipuna ki Aotearoa e teto katahi manu waruro ona te kumarima, e tepuaki au ki Ngātia, e noho ana au ki whakatū, he tangata tiriti ahau ko Abbie Reynolds taku ingoa. Thank you so much for having me, and I am really sorry I'm doing this over technology because it's never as good. We can pretend, but it's always so much nicer to be in person, and as a speaker it's always so much nicer to be able to see the whites of people's eyes as well and know if my jokes have landed. So I won't be doing any jokes today because I won't know if you're laughing or not. It's also really ironic for me that I can't join you because the weather was so bad yesterday I couldn't get into whāngarei, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the climate and the biodiversity intersection. And you know, there's no mistaking the fact that these big weather events we've had in the last little while have been made worse by climate change. So it sort of feels like a really horrible irony. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing over this past, well, it's actually been 2 years. It was meant to be a year, and I'll explain a little bit of that in a moment. So I'm going to share my screen now. We're having some fun with the technology. So let's hope that from my end I can make it work. Whoop, that's not what I was hoping to show. Okay. Does that look like you've got a picture of a slideshow that you're expecting to see? Yeah? Yeah. Great. That's a win. So during the COVID crisis, I saw this particular cartoon and it really struck me. I was really kind of struck by the fact that we sort of got these series of crises which are building up, and a growing question about why we're not solving climate and biodiversity together. When I was at the Sustainable Business Council, we were talking then, and this is, you know, 6 or 7 years ago, about natural climate solutions, and we were starting to see evidence that the solutions to climate change that we can get from nature are going to be the lowest cost ones. They're going to help us to reduce emissions, and they're going to help us as well to restore nature and to adapt to a changing climate. So when I finished up at Predator Free and the next foundation came and said to me, would you like a fellowship? What would you focus on? I was really interested in looking more closely at this. This is the project pitch I gave them. Whānau, it would be fair to say that this is not how it went, but you know, at least you have a sense of what I was aiming for when I started. I was really interested in who the systems entrepreneurs are, and sorry, that's really not very nice language, but that's kind of the language of systems change. But who are the people who are working in the intersection of climate and biodiversity? And kind of thinking about what it would be useful for them in order just to know about each other, because it became clear to me quite early on that there were lots of people working in that space who didn't know about each other. The second was the idea of getting everyone together, or some people together, and mapping the system. Again, not very helpful language, but the idea of kind of trying to understand who the players were, all the forces that are sort of acting on the system that keep it stuck where it is. And then the final piece was this idea of creating collaborations, like once we've done a bit of systems mapping together, what might we know, what might we work on together? So that was the plan. About, well, it's more than 2 years ago now, what I started with was kind of this idea of a systems thinking approach, and lots of you will be working in this way, so and you probably know more about it than I do, but this idea of kind of taking a systems practice, systems thinking, systems change approach is something that I wanted to be part of my learning experience. So I spoke to some people, and someone suggested the Acumen Academy systems practice course, which is free. It's online if this is your bag. And it was kind of a really simple process. You came with a project, which I thought I had. You frame the challenge, what are the goals? You explore the forces acting on that system, identify some feedback loops, map the system, and then find points of leverage. And these points of leverage are the places in a system where for kind of minimum effort, you can get maximum change. Well, that was how it started. I got very stuck at around point 2 or point 3, and I got stuck there for about a year, which is very frustrating for someone like me who's used to working quite quickly through things. And I had to stay stuck, I think, because that was a really useful place to learn. In the end, I interviewed over 45 people who were working in that climate and biodiversity intersection, and I really was just asking them about where they saw the barriers and where they saw the enablers, and using that as a way of kind of building up a picture of the system. I was trying to get to a place where I could draw a systems dynamic map, but man, it was so hard, and I did a few little workshops with people who know the territory, and in the end, couldn't pull that off. But what I did end up doing was writing a 27-page report about all of the enablers and barriers. And then that I used as a hook to invite a number of people into a hui, about 15 of the people I interviewed. And the work we did together was to identify where, whether the systems as I had kind of mapped them, whether that was a useful diagnosis, and then to work together to identify some points of leverage. So I'm going to take you through some of the findings of that today. Just a very brief word. I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions today. And again, I'm sure this is language you're familiar with, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Now, the idea of nature-based solutions are the solutions provided by nature to societal challenges, which includes climate change. And so they provide benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity. When I'm thinking about climate change and biodiversity, solutions to those are definitely nature-based solutions, but there are lots of nature-based solutions which won't necessarily be focused on climate change or biodiversity. It'll be, you know, like I've read examples of things like community gardens are great nature-based solutions, but not in the kind of territory I'm looking at. And some pictures here of some really great nature-based solutions. You know, mangroves is a great flood protection and good for sequestering carbon. Beautiful having some biodiversity in our cities in the middle picture, and then restoration of the kind of oceans and the ocean fringe is a really important opportunity to restore biodiversity and help address climate change. So that's just to make sure we're all kind of talking the same language. So what were the barriers that people talked to me about? The kind of first and most critical is that the climate change crisis is a hot issue and the biodiversity crisis is not a hot issue. And I'm sure this is something that all of you working in Kauri, dieback and myrtle rust come across. But when we talk about climate change being a hot issue, people talked about the fact that we had recent legislation. There are, you know, incentives and regulation, a kind of whole suite of things which are going on to help, you know, shift us towards lower carbon ways of doing things. We've got this 1.5 degree or lower ambition in our legislation, and there's a really high degree of public awareness and public concern about climate change. You know, as a director of Auckland Transport, we see sort of the data around what Aucklanders are thinking about climate change, and it's, you know, 85% plus kind of levels of awareness and concern and desire to act. But when it comes to biodiversity, what we heard was that there is an issue is just cold. It's not, it doesn't have recent legislation, and people talked about how out of date that legislation is. We don't have, you know, threatened species specific legislation, and it's certainly not considered to be consistent now with turbidity. The focus is largely on regulation, particularly when it's outside the kind of DOC estate. Lots of people talk to me about the lack of a clear and compelling vision or ambition, and that's despite Te Mana o Te Taio, which is the biodiversity strategy. But people talked about the absence of something that people could get together around and really think about how they were contributing to making a difference. And just really low levels of public concern about biodiversity loss. And for me, this is the piece I found so interesting. Every year, Kantar do this market research about the state of what New Zealanders are thinking about sustainability and what do they call it, better futures. And they've been doing it for about 15 or 20 years now. And every year in the top 5, you get sort of a couple about plastics or waste in the environment. Sometimes climate change makes it into the top 10, but biodiversity never does. And I asked the woman who runs it about this a few years ago, and what she said was that biodiversity was the second to bottom issue of the 30 or 40 that they survey on. So that kind of tells you where New Zealanders in general are on this issue. But more interestingly, she told me that the kind of comparative surveys in Australia and in the UK, biodiversity is in the top 5. So Australians and Brits are very much more concerned about biodiversity loss than we are here. And I think that's just a really interesting comparative point. But the fact that climate change is a hot issue and biodiversity is not is a real barrier to them being solved together, because it's really difficult to convince anyone to take a biodiversity lens on a climate initiative when actually no one's really shouting that loudly at you about it. There were some major policy and governance barriers, and I am imagining that for many of you, these will be really familiar. Everybody talked about the institutional silos at the UN level. Biodiversity is dealt with differently from climate, in the government level, in the agency level, in business, but also in regional and local council. That climate is dealt with here and biodiversity is dealt with over here, and they're not necessarily linked together. And the problem with that is that results in some pretty fragmented policy making. So you get this sort of policy inconsistency. People talk about this climate tunnel vision, where our climate policy setting just doesn't take into account what's happening, what it means for biodiversity. And I got so many examples of, things like the ETS privileging pines, but not really encouraging us to do the right thing for our native ecosystems and restoring those, where we get multiple benefits. So we get this issue of kind of value of policy outcomes which are just really targeted at one thing, and we don't think about the co-benefits. But even more interesting is the impact this has and the costs and confusion that this occurs when you think about this at place, because biodiversity restoration is so place-based. And I had this great example of this one farmer in Pūtaruru, has a river running through his property, and he is absolutely clear he wants to do the right thing. He's doing riparian planting. He wants to restore the quality of the water in the awa. He is trying to get natives on the land that he's currently using for pines and the ETS. He wants to do all the right things in terms of the environmental management of this farm. And he talked about the 7 or 8 different agencies he has to work with in order to get any of that done, and how their approaches are inconsistent, how it's really confusing, and just the really high transaction costs he has to get any of that done. So this idea of the institutional silos really flows down through to those on the ground who are trying to do the work, and how hard it becomes for them to do the right thing. And that's not even taking into account the sorts of issues we see around path dependency. So this came up a bit, and I think about this a lot as an Auckland Transport Director. When I'm thinking about what Auckland Transport needs to do on climate, I often wonder what nature-based solutions we could be using. When I look at what the big climate impacts are for our organisation, our roads are going to melt a lot more frequently in the future, but we know tree planting down the sides of roads is a really effective way of keeping those roads cool. But making that normal inside Auckland Transport is filled with barriers. And there are lots of them, and they are all there for good reason. But this idea of path dependency, where large organisations are kind of, almost doesn't matter what the inputs are, you're always going to spit out a sort of similar output over time, is because they've got systems and processes and cultures and ways of operating which keep them kind of on rails. So for me, Auckland Transport has a design manual that kind of dictates what gets built in what situations. Massive business casing processes which require cost benefit analysis. There are all of these systems and processes, let alone a kind of way of thinking about what the organisation is for, which is really prioritised towards things like grey infrastructure. Can we do that with pipes? Can we do it with concrete? It's not an organisation that thinks first about whether it could be doing it with nature. And then this is all kind of emphasised or kind of made more rigid by a really low level of risk appetite. And you can understand why. For most local councils, they're spending ratepayer money. They need to know they're getting it right. But it makes it really difficult, and it creates a disincentive to try new things. And also there is a culture of, being engineers and kind of, grey concrete infrastructure first. And all of that feeds into the way that decisions get made. So even as a director, I'm really interested in seeing nature-based solutions. There's a lot that would have to change inside the organisational structures and its engine for nature-based solutions to even be something that I get to make a decision on as a director. So there's quite a big barrier for the larger entities who are potentially going to be making nature-based solutions real. None of you will be surprised to know that there are kind of quite major knowledge and information barriers. Science, so many people I spoke to talked about the insufficiency of science in the conservation space, just the absence of some basic ecology and biology is missing. But equally, when we're talking about climate and biodiversity, not even the beginnings of enough science, which tells us about the way ecosystems are going to be affected by climate change or the contribution they could make in terms of sequestering carbon and helping us adapt to a changing climate. And this insufficiency of science becomes a real problem when we start to think about how to attract investment from outside government into biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. There's also issues around integration and application of the science that's out there. Again, this won't be news to any of you, but the fact that we've got lots of different bits of science, but they don't necessarily join up in ways which are useful for the people who are trying to do climate and biodiversity restoration. And that it's not clear that once we've got new science that it finds its way into the actual on the ground application quickly. For those people like my farmer in Putararu, how does he get access to that good science? It is available. A lot of it's locked up in pay-for journals, and a lot of it is put together in a way that the layperson can't use or understand. So we've kind of got multiple layers of challenge just in the science and data space. There are barriers around information and knowledge as well. When I think about nature-based solutions, there's lots around, but how do people find out who's working on them? Who's designing them? What are they learning? What are they learning about the social process? How do we get access to information about the business case and what works and what doesn't? When we go back to my path dependency example, like if I think about Auckland Transport, how would it get access from other councils about who's tried tree planting and how well it works or doesn't? Talked about that kind of the challenge of the multiple agencies, but actually just getting information about who is who in the zoo. When you're thinking about doing a nature-based solution, like where would you go? What do you need to navigate? What are the rules, but what are the opportunities? Who's got money to invest? There are some challenges in the restoration space or in the pest or predator eradication space for people trying to just make sure we've got capability and capacity and basic knowledge around which species are natives and which ones are pests or weeds which can be pulled out. We've got a lot of work to be done on the ground, and so how those people who are volunteers often actually build their capability to identify which species are native and which ones are weeds is a real challenge. And then all the challenges with access to innovation and technology that we need in this space in order to help us go faster. And that's often related to finance and resourcing barriers. One of my biggest insights actually was that we have become so enculturated to there not being enough money in conservation restoration that people don't even name that. Of the 46 interviews I did, no one said to me, there's not enough money here. They all went straight to, here are the things I'm doing to bring more money in. So a real scarcity mentality. We've kind of lost the fight and the argument about actually we need more money coming into what is essentially our public green infrastructure. Many of you will know we've got lots of challenges around how we value nature, how it comes into our standard economic and financial processes, how a tree is treated as a liability rather than an asset, even though it has all of these great services it provides in cities. And lots of challenges around how funding is allocated to the short term over the long term, and how we struggle to value those things where we know we're avoiding future cost. And then I've already talked about the investability issues and the need, if we're going to attract private and philanthropic investment into ecosystem restoration, we need really good science, we need good data, and we need good models to give those investors confidence that if they're putting their money in, that they're going to get the outcome, the improvement that they're looking for. And then the final area is around public awareness and mindsets. And again, I come back to a systems change kind of model here with the iceberg, and the fact that underlying all of the stuff I've talked about are these mental models and maps. And the interviewees I spoke to just named so many different perceptions, mindsets, worldviews, biases that keep us stuck. Things like landowners really wanting to honour the legacy of their parents who cleared the land, despite the fact that the land is just, it's got no value for farming reasons, but that sense of wanting to honour legacy. Really interesting attitudes around land ownership and how stuck that keeps us when we've got this sort of sense in which we've got total domination and agency, despite the fact that we're always going to be affected by, you know, neighbouring land geography and geology. Lots of biases that got named, biases towards grey infrastructure, biases towards silver bullet solutions, and also this real challenge with fear of failure and a bias against innovation as a result, or a bias against trying things. And then a lot of talk about what worldviews are keeping us stuck, the kind of really deeply individualistic, short-term, a lot of distrust of, you know, large institutions or government. But I think that last piece and the kind of sense in which people could name these was one of the things that did give me a bit of a sense of optimism, that people are really aware of the worldview now that shapes so much of this. And I think my hypothesis on that is because that goes to one of the key enablers that people talked about, which is te ao Māori. I think everyone I spoke to talked about the importance of te ao Māori as a worldview, both as a major enabler of change, but as a way of helping us understand how stuck our current worldview is keeping us, or the dominant worldview keeps us. People talked about the kind of values of holism, kaitiakitanga, connection to people, connection to place, the intergenerational nature of te ao Māori approaches, and how excited they are that we've got co-governance and that we're starting to see decision-making which is more balanced, and that we're seeing really, really good outcomes from Māori-led organisations. So a lot of optimism in that space. International efforts are seen as probably giving us a good run for our money and likely to impact us. We've got some upcoming law changes and an MPS on Indigenous biodiversity, hopefully. Some growing local momentum, some really cool stuff coming from, you know, local volunteer organisations, the not-for-profit sector, but also from business. And a lot of capacity now for more integrated approaches, people working together collectively and holistically, which seems to me a really powerful kind of driver for change. Long gone are the hero days where we could do these things by ourselves. The change we need will only happen from us all working together. And then in the hui, we identified some kind of really interesting points of potential leverage. So again, this idea that places to work where for the kind of minimum input, a minimum amount of effort, we could get the maximum output. And many of you will know that the role of narrative is really critical, how powerful narrative can be in, you know, shifting those mindsets that I talked about, how they help people start to contextualize, you know, what's going on and why. The idea of a nature-based solutions institute, which is something we've seen overseas, but a conversation about how we would reframe value, start to take a more holistic, broader, longer-term view about what value is and how we connect to nature. Biodiversity markets, incentives and policy are seen as a really kind of hot area right now, and there's a lot going on in that space. A bit of a left field idea was the drive for rights for materials. Bit of focus on the idea that connecting, like working together, that just building relationships between people working in a space could be a policy objective in itself. Again, won't surprise any of you, but regional clusters got a lot of focus, and I think there's real strength in that because, you know, one of my big learnings from this process is, you know, you affect climate change pretty much from anywhere, but when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystems, that's so place-based. A real strong interest in intergenerational decision making and how that's really driven by intergenerational living and doing that together. Bringing champions together, people who can get together and really strongly advocate as people of mana for change. So people really interested in that as a way of making change. Driving towards longer term decision making, which I think is probably necessary across multiple fronts. Real focus on education for young people. There was a real sense of fear and concern about the fact that our young people are growing up really disconnected from nature and what we might do about that. And that final piece is the idea of the working on developing the vision. Like, what could a vision for restoration of nature in Aotearoa New Zealand be, which would be compelling and bring people together collectively to, you know, do their bit. And so just to finish off, I suppose I had sort of 3 insights really. The first was about my process and how hard that system diagnosis is and how hard it was to sit and just talking about the problems. And how slow that was, and at the hui, how emotional that was for a lot of us, because we could really see how stuck and how self-perpetuating the system is, but actually really ultimately useful, because I think so many of the people I talk to jump straight to solutions. And I think sitting with the really understanding where the barriers are and anticipating those before we start kind of thinking about solutions, you know, really seems to me useful, like anticipating what stuff we're going to bang into, because we know it's there when we turn our minds to it. The piece around working collectively and bringing people together as a solution in its own right seems to me to have real legs. I think we forget that change gets done by people and between people, and so, you know, actually investing in that more frequently and more deeply seems to me, again, and I think I keep learning this, but it seems to me a really useful thing to do. And then ultimately, there are some really foundational shifts in mindsets and approaches that are needed if we're going to respond to the crises in time. You know, that when we look at climate and biodiversity, some of the mindsets which drive both of them are, you know, the ones which are going to need to change. And I think those are really big, hard conversations, and I would imagine that some of them are mindsets that you're coming up against as well in your work and in Kauri dieback and in myrtle rust as well. Like, how do we get people to reconnect with nature and understand that we are utterly reliant on it? So that was all I was intending to cover today. I hope you were all able to hear me and that I was shouty enough. I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'm really happy to take them if there are any. Kia ora koutou e ngā mihi ngui. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koe, Abbie. We do really feel the irony that you couldn't be with us today, but thank you so much for coming through the screen in such an engaging way. Can you see anybody now? No, you can't. Okay, it's all a lie. We're actually all at a nightclub, not listening at all. No, kei te pai. Thank you so much, especially for your diagrams and bringing us into the amazing range of mahi that you do. Kia kaha koe. I live in Auckland, so please feel free to work as hard as you want. Kia ora. Thank you so much. Ho mai, te paki paki, kia paki paki mai. Thank you.
Thank you.